I believe that the Israel Defense Forces can act with far greater ferocity and with far greater effect and actually bring Hamas to its knees. It's the assessment of the Israeli intelligence community that Iran is manufacturing weapons and delivery systems and ballistic missiles at such a pace that were they to be delivered, the damage caused by landfall would have the potential to be the equivalent of a nuclear strike on the homeland here in Israel. If the Prime Minister is able to go to the polls as the individual who oversees the complete destruction of Hamas inside Gaza and the complete end to the Iranian nuclear menace, then he'll be in a strong position indeed. Turning now to events that are taking place inside the Gaza Strip, there are reports that suggest that the Israel Defense Forces is drawing up operational instructions and guidelines for the complete toppling and dismantling of Hamas as a terror organization, and with the goal of robbing Hamas of posing a potent military or terror military threat to Israel ever again. So a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind about this. Firstly, one of the scandals, quite frankly, that surrounded the immediate aftermath of the October 7th massacre was that the Israel Defense Forces had not planned militarily how to go in and take over the Gaza Strip in the event of a massive attack coming from that enclave. The last person to do so was years prior to October the 7th, and it was actually then Major General Eyal Zamir, who today is the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, but back then was head of the Southern Command. The IDF took an absolutely reprehensible moratorium when it came to military planning for Gaza, and it's absolutely appropriate that whether there is an intention for the government to order the IDF forward into Gaza or not, the IDF continues to plan for such a scenario. So in any eventuality, it's absolutely right and proper that planning is taking place. With that having been said, the whole notion of this ceasefire was predicated upon a very clear, in my opinion, and deliberate misrepresentation by President Donald Trump, and I don't mean that in a negative sense about the president, but a clear misrepresentation by President Donald Trump of the words of Hamas when they messaged and communicated to the president that they were willing to enter into some sort of ceasefire agreement, but they were absolutely not of the view that they were going to disarm or dismantle their terror network. They never said that they would do that. They never declared that they would do that. But the president misrepresented those messages and essentially said Hamas has agreed to return all of the hostages and to disarm, and with that in mind, we can bring about a ceasefire inside the Gaza Strip. So this is the danger of misrepresentation or misinterpretation of a very clear message coming from a terror network that absolutely stands by its word. In terms of what might happen inside Gaza, the IDF holds about 53% of the enclave to this point, roughly the area that is referred to as being up to the yellow line or within the yellow line, although that yellow line is a little bit fluid. And beyond that yellow line, Hamas is reconstituting itself. It is regenerating its ranks. It is retaking control of the areas in which it's found. And I have always been of the opinion, I've never moved from this opinion, that it is possible to bring about complete and total military victory against the terror organizations inside Gaza, namely Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. I think that all of the language and all of the analysis and all of the highfalutin commentary that said that you can never have victory against this enemy is complete and total defeatism. I want to give you an example of why. Take the Nazis of World War II. There is nobody watching this who will be of the opinion that Nazis no longer exist in this world, that neo-Nazis don't exist in this world. But what you will recognize is that while they can continue to exist here and there, what you're able to do is smash them militarily, as was done during the events of the Second World War, and then in perpetuity prevent them from assembling and forming up into a threat against, quite frankly, democratic regimes. The very same can be done against Hamas. The very same can be done against Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And given that the hostages are no longer inside the Gaza Strip, I believe that the Israel Defense Forces can act with far greater ferocity and with far greater effect and actually bring Hamas to its knees. Now, just before anybody jumps on me for saying that, of course, the absence of the hostages does not mean an increased willingness to target innocent civilians. We will undertake all of the measures that we require of ourselves in order to shepherd civilians out of the hot zones of kinetic conflict. But once that's done, I believe that we're able to move very quickly, definitively, and with enormous force through the various target areas inside the Gaza Strip in order to disarm Hamas. As President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have both said, Hamas has two choices. They can disarm the nice way, the easy way, or they can disarm the hard way. I think we're looking down the barrel of them having to disarm the hard way, namely with the boot of the IDF on the neck of Hamas as a terror organization. One or two other points to keep in mind. We've just learned that there are about 5,000 Indonesian troops who are set to be deployed to operate inside Gaza as part of the arrangements under the auspices of the Board of Peace. It's an odd piece of information because Israel doesn't have any diplomatic ties with Indonesia, although relations did seem to be on their way to warming a few months ago at the UN General Assembly. That really does cause us to have to wonder which is going to come first, a major operation inside the Gaza Strip or the presence and arrival of the Indonesians whose schedule we do not currently know. So those are just a couple of things to think about. So turning now to the topic of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C., please keep in mind that for a sitting Prime Minister to travel to Washington, D.C. for what is scheduled to be a 32-hour visit, meaning he's going to touch down, have a couple of nights sleep perhaps, and he's going to have a series of meetings. That means that he's there on business. This meeting is expected to be absent any of the fanfare that one would associate with a visit by a head of another state to the White House. He is there on business. One of the things that signifies the point that he's traveling on business is that he is accompanied by the incoming head of the Israeli Air Force, Omer Tishler. Now, the presence of that man is one that ought to be very, very ominous for the Iranians. We saw during the 12-day war just how capable Israel's Air Force was, including prior to the joining of the fray by the Americans. So his presence there is not to be overlooked and quite frankly cannot be overstated. The importance of him being in those rooms, the importance of the meetings that he'll surely be having with his counterparts over in the Pentagon. In addition to that, Prime Minister Netanyahu traveling there shows that there is a conspicuous absence in terms of his team. That the absence to which I'm referring is that of Ron Dermer. This is the sort of meeting that in the past Ron Dermer would have been dispatched to handle as Bibi's most trusted confidant and emissary. Ron Dermer has stepped down from his position as Minister of Strategic Affairs, and so I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu views himself as the only individual who can fill Ron Dermer's shoes in these types of meetings with the Americans. Now, the US force buildup there is extremely significant, and it continues to build. Not all of the ordnance that the Americans are moving to the area is yet present. And so that ratchets up the credibility of this military threat that is marshaled against the backdrop of the negotiations that are currently taking place. Now, it's those negotiations or the content of those negotiations that on face value seem to be the reason that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington, D.C. The Americans have said that the negotiations focus on Iran's nuclear weapons program, the same program that the Iranians deny having. The Iranians say that they're willing to have negotiations centered around the subject of enrichment. But the Israelis say that any agreement between the US and Iran must include 3 points. Number one, an end to the Iranian nuclear weapons program, total end to enrichment, for example. Number two, the curbing, the very strict curbing and limitations on Iran's ballistic missiles program, and number three, the curbing, perhaps even the complete dismantling of Iran's terror proxy network. Now, a lot of people are saying, why is Israel so adamant about curbing the ballistic missile program? And why is it placing near to equal importance upon curbing that program as it is to curbing the nuclear weapons program? Well, the answer is that it is the assessment of the Israeli intelligence community that Iran is manufacturing weapons and delivery systems and ballistic missiles at such a pace that were they to be delivered, the damage caused by landfall would have the potential to be the equivalent of a nuclear strike on the homeland here in Israel. So Prime Minister Netanyahu naturally sees such an outcome as completely, totally and utterly untenable, and he's going there to speak to President Donald Trump about that. That's what he needs the president to agree to, but whether or not President Trump is minded to agree to that is anybody's guess. And there's also a question as to whether these negotiations actually have any teeth to them whatsoever, given the sheer scale of this massive military buildup in the area over there in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. So when you think about the schedule of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, you'll understand that it's an extremely packed schedule with any number of very serious and consequential considerations at its heart and guiding it. On this particular occasion, Prime Minister Netanyahu has brought forward his visit to Washington, D.C. by 1 week. He was scheduled to be there a few days later. He's brought it forward by a week. It's a very short visit. And I actually believe that there will be some level of political outcomes and consequences for the Prime Minister when it comes to the subject of what Israel does inside Gaza and what Israel can achieve against the Iranians. And I'll explain that to you. I don't believe that security decisions of this magnitude are predicated upon political considerations. But we are in the beginnings of election season here in Israel. The major party leaders are in full swing in terms of their electioneering. There are campaign signs on the buses, on the streets, anywhere and everywhere that you look, and the usual suspects are out in full force throughout the Israeli media. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be running for re-election. There are many voters here in Israel who believe that the Prime Minister has to take ultimate responsibility, not blame, but ultimate responsibility for the disaster that occurred on October 7th. There are also many voters who look at the Prime Minister's leadership after October 7th, in particular the fight back on all 7 fronts, and they credit him with very, very virtuous outcomes and brave decision making. But that fight back is not complete even by the Prime Minister's own definition. He expressed that the goals of the war against Hamas were to bring all of the hostages home. That was achieved, albeit with several hostages no longer possessed of life, and the dismantling of Hamas. That has not been achieved. And in addition to that, the Prime Minister has said for years that he is the man to curb the menace that is trained upon Israel from Iran by the Iranians. That menace seems not to have been destroyed by way of the 12-day war. And if the Prime Minister is able to go to the polls as the individual who oversees the complete destruction of Hamas inside Gaza and the complete end to the Iranian nuclear menace, then he'll be in a strong position indeed. And the Israeli voter will be more inclined to move towards his side of the checkbox. Hi folks, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the MirYam Institute Situational Briefing. I hope that you're enjoying our content, and if you are, please be sure to hit the subscribe and the like button, because doing so means that you'll receive all of our top tier commentary and our exclusive footage as soon as it's published. And remember, we very much want to hear what's on your mind, and we want to know what your questions are. So please be sure to leave a comment and a question in the comment section. Thank you, and I look forward to next time.